Hello everyone. This will be a pretty quick web app exercise. Should take less than an hour if you're familiar with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and you were doing it on your own, or of course following along. But could take longer if you're newer to this subject. I think this is a great exercise because you'll be working with some HTML and some CSS to be able to create a web page that you can view on both the desktop and a phone, while also working with some JavaScript and learning how to update a page without reloading and to do some basic recursive functions. And as you can see on the screen right now is pettypayment.com, which is a website I created a while back just as an exercise. And what it's for is you basically can come in here and just input any amount of money in dollars. I'm doing $36.49. It can show a lot. And you can choose what breakdown you would like to show how to pay. So if I was going to use only pennies, how many pennies would it take to get that amount of money? Well, of course, a penny is just equal to 1 penny, 1 cent, so it's 3,649. But what about quarters? Well, you can see here, this is what it would take to actually create. So you have quarters, and then if there's any value left over, it'll break it down into the further breakdown. And we can go all the way up to $20 bills, which is right there. So that's what we're going to be creating today. And depending on how much experience you have, this might look complicated, it might not, but it's a good exercise nonetheless. So I already have this localhost 8000 up here, which is where I'm going to be showing this. There's lots of ways to be able to access your website as you're designing it. Partially, it's dependent on what text editor you use. Some like Brackets, which I'll have linked in the description, will have a live preview way to be able to view your document that you're creating. I'm going to be using Visual Studio, as you can see here, with my index.html, my single page of HTML I'll be having. Main.js, which is also empty and will be my JavaScript file that I'll be linking to in my index, and my actual styling, my CSS. Right now, there will be nothing on that screen, but as you can see, it said localhost 8000. And what that means in my case is that's how I'm going to access it with my terminal. So down here, I'm just going to go ahead and use Python. If you already have Python installed, this is a great way to run any kind of like web server to have your project show, especially if you have JavaScript, where a lot of times it does require a web server to run. So I'm just going to go ahead and do python-mhdtp server. A little difficult for me to say there. If I press enter, you'll see it now is serving on this link here. And I'll show you that it's working in a second once we have something actually written down. I'll have a link to what this command with Python actually does in the terminal. In case anyone is curious, that'll be in the description. So we'll go ahead and push that down so it can't be seen. And we'll also go ahead and hide the Explorer since we're not going to be having any more documents in this and give ourselves some more room. All right, so let's go ahead and start with actually creating that template for our web page. It's going to be like any other HTML document if you've created one before. We're going to have a doc type HTML. We're also going to have our HTML tags, head tags, and we're going to have our body tags. I'm not going to go too in depth into what each of these do, other than the head is mainly for the meta information of your page, and then the body is what you're actually going to be showing. This the most simplified form of what that could be. A lot of good courses online if you want more information on that. May link a couple. But we're going to be focusing on just the exercise today. So we're not going to be having much in the head because of that. We're mainly just going to have the title, which we're going to have match roughly the other one. So we're going to call ours the same thing as that other website I was just showing a second ago. Payment. To double check that our website is working, let's go ahead and go over here to my Edge. Refresh, and we can see here at the title, I know it's kind of small for some of you, it'll say Petty Payment. From there, let's go ahead and get started with our actual body. We'll be putting nothing else in the head for right now, though we will be linking our CSS and our JavaScript down the road, but right now we're just starting with this. Starting off, let's create a container to hold everything for us. I have a div, and we don't have any classes set up yet, but I always like to call my main container main container. And from there, let's go ahead and create the title of the page. If we go back to petty payment, we can see it says petty payment, and let's find out how petty you can be. I'm going to go ahead and copy that so I don't have to retype it, but I will retype petty payment. So since it's going to be the title of our page, we'll want to put that in a header 1 to be the largest. Payment. Let the page know it is the most important tag here. And then as an H2, we're going to go ahead and have that second piece that I copied. So now if we go back to the Edge browser again, go back to hours and reload, we can see here petty payment. Let's find out how petty you could be. It's, of course, for those of you who are not too familiar with CSS, it's going to be looking different from this page for right now. That's because we'll be doing our styling down the road, and once we have the main pieces of the website created, and that's how we can make it look a little bit nicer. Going back to Visual Studio, we now have the title and the secondary title of our page, but we don't have any way for the user to import any data. So I'm going to add a break here to give a little bit more room, and then I'm going to create a form to actually hold our data and our inputs and be able to access that with our JavaScript we're going to be doing down the road. So we're just going to name the form payment form. Actually, I'll do it like this, payment form. Now, normally with the form, when you would hit a submit button or anything like that, it'll reload the page because you're actually sending the form to something, right? But we don't actually want to reload the page when we submit. So because of that, we'll just do this little hack on submit. We're going to just want to return false. And that's just basically telling our form don't reload. Now in our form, we're not going to have anything at the moment. We go back to our Edge over here and reload. You'll see nothing has really changed. That's because we're going to want to actually add stuff into the form. Right now, we just have the basic container saying it is a form. So first, we're going to want the first label that we'll see. We're going to go ahead and do a label. We're going to say the label is going to be for the F. Keep it in the parentheses. We're going to call it F payment. And we're just going to have it say payment in dollars. Again, this will only work in US dollars. I'm not going to be doing anything with euro or anything, but we could talk about some ways to improve this website down the road, and that could be one of them. So now if we were to go back to Edge and reload, we can see here it says that payment amount in, but it doesn't actually have anywhere for us to enter anything. And I didn't put a colon either, which I would like to have a colon just for visuals. So let's go ahead and colon there. And then we'll want to create the actual input for this label. So we're going to do an input tag. We only want this input to be able to take numbers. That's because we're going to be breaking apart values of money, right? So we don't want it to take any strings or anything, so we'll say number. You'll see me type double parentheses a lot here on accident. That's just because I'm not quite used to Visual Studio all the time, not letting me overwrite it. But we'll also want a minimum number for this input to take. We can't really break apart negative money. If you have negative 10 cents, we can't say how many pennies that is because that doesn't make sense, right? So we're going to want it to be a minimum of 0 that box will allow. We'll have a step of 1 penny at a time. I'll show what this means in just a second, but we'll set that to 1 penny. We'll have a value, which is what will show in the box until the actual user changes it to something else. And we'll have the ID that it's associated with. That way we can grab that value with JavaScript and we know which label it goes with. That will be that F payment amount. So now if we were to go to Edge and reload, you can see we now have the $0 being shown. We have an input box where we can input values. You can see we go past the amount, but when I click off, actually when I click enter, it'll go ahead and say that it will only take the nearest valid numbers. Now, if you remember, we also had that step piece of the input, and that's what these arrows do here. So we said it has a step of 1 penny at a time. So if I were to click the arrow up or down, it'll go at a time. And let me actually zoom in a bit here as well so that it looks a bit nicer for you guys. So now we have the first piece of the input. And you may notice here when I saved, my Visual Studio does auto format a lot. It did break this line into 2 lines. That's just because for my own use, when I have multiple pages open in a single Visual Studio, I have my max column amount set to 80. So if I have more than 80 characters on a line, it'll go ahead and break it appropriately into more lines. But yours does not have to look identical to that, of course. So now we have the inputted number that we can work with, but we want to also have this piece right here where we can actually say what kind of breakdown we want. So how do we do that? We keep adding to the form. So we'll do a break or two. I'll actually go ahead and do 2 breaks here just to give us some room on the page. And we'll have another label. So we'll go ahead and name this label for, there's those double parentheses again, you guys. We'll do for F breakdown. If I could type. This will be the label for that breakdown dropdown. And we're just going to go ahead and call it breakdown. So let's work on actually creating that dropdown. In HTML, the dropdown is actually a select tag. Go ahead and give it the same name as the label for it, or what that label is for, technically. And we'll give it the ID as well. You can see here Visual Studio created the in tag for us. And between that, we can go ahead and put in the options. If we were to save this right now, go back to Edge and reload, you can see we have nothing in this breakdown. We haven't listed what it should be yet. So in this, we'll go ahead and do that with the option tags. So if we do option, we'll give it a value. The first one will be pennies. So we'll do penny. And then what we'll actually see in the dropdown. So we'll put pennies, multiple. Save it. So now if we come back here, we can see we have pennies. Now that we have all the values we're going to be working with here, we can start actually, well, I guess checking to see if that did load. We should go back and see. See, all those are here. And we'll want to have some way to submit this to the JavaScript, which we can show now. And just one note here, if you're going to be following my JavaScript and whatnot one-to-one, make sure that all the values you have here are identical to mine. So just below the select, we're going to have 2 more breaks. Again, some room for us. And for those of you who are newer to HTML, the breaks are basically the spacing between different elements here. So we have this line, we have some breaks, we have this line, etc. Otherwise, they'd be a lot more smushed. So next, we're going to go ahead and do an input again, but this time we'll call it submit. We'll also name it submit. And on click, we're actually going to have it call a function, which we would just call calculate. Now, calculate doesn't exist yet. We have to create that, but we know we're going to name it that, so why not just put it for now? And then value will be calculate. This will be what we'll show on the page. So if we go back over here, reload, we'll have this calculate button. But we can go ahead and get started with that. Oh, and before I forget as well, we're going to want somewhere for us to be able to put the information, the breakdown of value that we're going to be showing the user. We're going to want somewhere to show that. On the actual website here, you can see it's put below the calculate. But when we reload and there is nothing to calculate, you can see there's nothing below it. The way we do that, and the way we are able to update without reloading the page, is we could just put a p tag here, a paragraph tag, give it an ID, we'll just call it return result, and we leave it empty. This is where our JavaScript will write to. So go ahead and save that. If we reload, we can see that doesn't show up there. And we can get started with the next piece, the actual JavaScript. So now we're looking at the JavaScript script. Sounds a little bit funny, but that is how that is there. And there's going to be a couple pieces that we're going to want to think about here, some things we want to design. So we know when looking at this front-end web page, we're going to have the value of the breakdown we're actually be bringing in. We're going to have what each of these are worth. $20 bills going to be worth 2,000 of our value because it's 2,000 pennies. I'll show why that makes sense in a sec. Pennies will be equal to 1, equals to 5, times 10, etc. So let's start off by creating a variable in JavaScript that can hold that information for us. We're going to want these values to match what we have on our index. We go back here, that would be penny, nickel, dime, etc. We want them to match 1 to 1 so that when we read from this form, we have somewhere that we can compare directly to get the breakdown value. We're going to name this breakdown values, and we're going to create it as a dictionary of sorts. So let's go ahead and fill these with the breakdown values that each would be. All right, now we have these breakdown values. So anytime we were looking at what value the breakdown actually has, we can look at this dictionary we have here. The next thing we're going to want to look at is what is the relationship with these breakdowns. What I mean by that is, say we're on the front end, back here, we're looking at $10 bills, but let's say we do it for $11.50. Well, if we only show what this is in $10 bills, it'll just be one $10 bill, or if you round up, it'll be 2. But then we still have a $1.50 that can't really be shown with this $10 bill breakdown. So we'll want to go smaller. Well, can a $1.50 be broken down by $5 bills? No. What about 1? Yes, we still have 50 cents though, right? Etc. So we're going to want a relationship of how do we go down this? What is the IDs that these are associated with as the next piece? There's lots of ways to go about this, but in terms of, I guess, just maintainability down the road, if you want to add more values or anything like that, I like having them in another dictionary. So we'll call this the breakdown relationship. This will be a dictionary as well, and it'll be in a form of, say, $20. You could spell it correctly. What is after the $20? If we break something up by $20, what step should we go down for next? Well, we'll want it to be $10, right? Because that is the step right after it. So let's go ahead and create each of those now. And there we go. We now have that breakdown relationship. So let's go down from there. Now we know how we want to continue to break these down if there's values left over. And we also know what these breakdown values are. So let's actually get started with that calculate function that we're calling from the front end. So it was called calculate. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. There we go. That auto-populate from Visual Studio sometimes gets me. And to make sure we're actually going to be calling this, if you remember our index.html, we have that paragraph return result that we're going to want to be presenting the results to, right? So let's go ahead and just populate it with something like connected. So how do we do that? Well, first we want to get the element that we're going to be actually writing to. So to do that, var result is what we'll call it, and document.get element by ID. And if you remember, we called this return result. And we're just going to want to update what return result, just call it result, what this return result paragraph actually is going to be showing. So we do that by result, which is the name of our variable there, in our HTML. And we're just going to go ahead and put, I actually would like to say success instead. And then we'll just return. If we went on the front end right now and ran this, nothing's going to happen. We can reload and nothing's showing up, right? That's because we've not actually connected to our HTML yet. Our HTML doesn't know where to look for that, that function. So that's the next piece of what we have to do. We'll be doing it in the head tag. You can technically add scripts in a lot of spots in HTML, but we're just going to do it up here. I'm going to do script type equals. I'm going to do text JavaScript, so it knows what type of file this is. going to pull from main.js, which is in the same directory, so we don't have to point it anywhere else. Yep. So now that we have that connected, if we go back to Edge and we reload, we press calculate, and see that success now shows up. So let's actually look at getting some data into this paragraph there instead of just success. So let's go ahead and take that out. And so that we don't have everything in calculate, and because I actually would like to use a recursive function, we're going to go ahead and create a new function that will be used to do all the calculations. So let's create a new function. Function calculate breakdown. And we'll be wanting to pass some parameters in here so it actually has some stuff to work with. First, we'll do the payment amount. That will be the value in the input that the person wants to see broken down. We'll name the second value top, which will be a Boolean to say this is the highest value that we'll start with. That'll make more sense in a few. And we're going to have the actual breakdown, which is what we're going to use to grab the breakdown values in relationship. So let's start off by passing all these to this. So result is going to be that paragraph of result, but let's get the information for this function. We're going to have a payment amount, which actually, let me change it to this to follow more of a JavaScript styling. So we'll have the payment amount, which will be the document, get element by ID just like above. Actually, what do we call it? I should probably remember. We have the F payment amount. That's what it was. So F payment amount. We're going to want to grab the actual value. Next, we'll have the breakdown select, which is what we'll use to actually pass the breakdown type into. Again, that will make sense in a moment. So var breakdown select equals document.get ID once again. And I believe we called it F breakdown, but let's go ahead and make sure. It's the name of that select right there. Right now, though, we're just going to be getting that select as a whole. We're getting that element. What we want to do is get the actual value that's been chosen on that select. So we'll do a var again. We'll do the breakdown type. And I keep forgetting that we're doing this in JavaScript, so I should follow more of that stuff. Breakdown type. Do that by breakdown select options. We're going to want to pass in that breakdown selected index. Let me go ahead and type that, and then I'll go ahead and explain what that means. Down select dot selected index. So what does this mean? It just means that we're grabbing the select, the actual drop down. We're grabbing all of this in this breakdown select. And then we're getting the actual type that's been selected by taking that selected tag, if you will, there, and getting the actual index that was selected. So this here basically provides a value to be able to get which of these we clicked. And then we're taking that value and we're putting it in a breakdown type. And just to make sure this works, let's go ahead and put it into that paragraph piece once again. So we'll do result.html equals, we'll just do breakdown type right now. So if we come back here, if I have pennies and I click this, oh, something's wrong. Let's see what it is. Good. There, I don't use Edge very often, which is why. If we go to console, we can see cannot read properties of under. Let's go back and see what that says. It's on the click of calculate, of course. So it seems to be having a problem with this index right here. Oh, I see what I did wrong here. I forgot an S. I'm sure some of you guys were yelling that at the screen. So now if we go back here, reload again, now that option is options, we can see that penny shows up. Nickel, dime, etc. And you'll notice here, this says pennies, but we have penny showing up. Why is that? Well, we go back to Visual Studio. We can see that in our index for pennies, the value is actually penny. So we're grabbing. So now that we have those appropriate pieces right there, we can go ahead and leave the result there. Let's pass those into that function that we created below. So calculate breakdown. We're going to have the payment amount, which we'll just pass in directly payment amount. Left top, which this is the first that we're calling this function, and that's what it means by top. So true. And then we're going to have the breakdown, which will be the breakdown type. And right now, if we call this document, or this function, it's not actually returning anything. However, when it does return something, it's not going to actually be going to anything, right? So we're going to want to give it to something. So we'll go ahead and take this result here, just use that instead, like this. That way, whatever this calculation returns, which should be the breakdown of the value, it goes right into that result in our HTML and gets printed onto the screen. All right, so let's go over the logic of what this calculate breakdown will need to do. Basically, we're just going to be breaking down the value we have, right? So it should be pretty straightforward. We're going to divide the value by whatever breakdown amount we're doing. If we're dividing by pennies, we're just dividing by 1, therefore it's just the amount. But what happens if we, for example, have an amount of 30, or let's do 23.50. If we pass in, maybe I should actually do this in a comment so that doesn't highlight anything. So if we pass in 23.50 as this payment amount right here, and we divide it by the pennies, which will be a breakdown, we can see a penny is going to be divided by 1, right? So if we divide that by 1, that's just going to equal, again, 23.50. But you can't have half pennies, and that's not the right amount of pennies to actually create that, right? Or to make that amount of money. We're going to want to move that decimal over 2 pieces so that we can see the amount of pennies that we'll have to have. 2,350 pennies is the amount to get to 23.50. So in order to pass that into this payment amount, I find it easier to do it out here in this calculate. So before we actually do the payment amount, let's go ahead and do payment amount. We're going to do times equals, which just means take whatever's on the right side of this and multiply it by the payment amount. 100. That way we get that decimal moved over twice. So the payment amount, instead of being 23.50, in this function we'll get 2,350. If we divide it by 1, we get the right amount of pennies. So if that makes sense, that's what we're going to be doing here. So let's go ahead and get started. What pieces are we going to need here? Well, first we're going to want to be returning something because it needs to go into this results here and be printed on the screen. So we know that the result is going to have to be a string. So let's go ahead and do result. We'll just make it an empty string for right now. We're also going to be modifying the payment amount by dividing, right, and getting a modulo. And so I like to, instead of using the parameter pass to do that, I like to create a new value or variable and make it equal to the pass parameter. And then we're going to want to also see how much of that breakdown goes into the amount. What I mean by this is if I add a little comment here, if we're going to have 23, or let's do 250, $2.50, right? That's 250 in this value that's being passed in. We're going to be dividing that by pennies. If we're going to be dividing it by the amount of pennies, we're going to want to be able to see how many pennies goes into that 250. So I can't think of a very good name for this right now, so we're just going to call it money count. Be the amount of, or maybe breakdown count. Let's do that. Breakdown count. We're going to have that equal to 0 to start out with. All right, let's actually start breaking up these values. So let's pretend the payment amount we're starting with is going to be that 2350, so 2,350. We want to see how many of the breakdown can go into that. So we're going to do breakdown count equals. I'm going to use the math.floor option because we're working with technically floats here with JavaScript. This is not too important to look into at the moment. If you're newer to this, if you're more experienced, you probably know what I'm talking about. But doing any kind of division or anything is not necessarily super accurate all the time. And so we're going to do math.floor, which means if we have a number such as 1.2, like for some reason it calculated 1.2 pennies, it'll go ahead and take off that decimal, move it down to the next full number below it. So I'm at that floor. We're going to take that payment that we have up above. That's, again, the value of the payment amount. We're going to divide it by however much the breakdown is worth. So remember, the breakdown is going to say penny, nickel, etc. So how do we get what that's worth from there? Well, we come back up to these breakdown values, and we can pass that ID in here and see what the value of that is. So we're going to go ahead and do the breakdown values, and we're going to pass in the breakdown ID to look up what that value is worth. So now we have how many things like quarters, dollars, etc. goes into the value. But how do we get what's left over of that value afterwards to see if we have to keep going? That's where the modulo operator will come in handy, and why we created that new payment variable. So we're going to do payment. We're going to do payment modulo. We'll do the breakdown values again with the same breakdown. And for those of you who have not used the modulo operator too often, it's basically just a remainder. So if you take the payment, you divide it by this value, what is the remainder? And we can actually make this a little bit prettier by putting the modulo here if we wanted. But just for this video, I'm going to keep it like this. So if we wanted to, we could now see what this breaks down into, and we could go ahead and return from this. I'm going to return result, which is right now an empty string. So how do we add to it? Well, we know what the breakdown count is. That's going to be the value of the breakdown that will be coming in. So let's just go ahead and make result. We'll make it plus equal just because we're going to be adding to it. It's an empty string right now. And we'll do the breakdown count. We'll want a space in there. And we can just put, let's just test pennies right now, actually. So let's do. Now that this is done, if we come back out here, we reload, press calculate 0 pennies, because it's $0, right? But if you do a full dollar, which will equal 100 when we send it to that function, and we're breaking it down by pennies, you'll see it says 100 pennies. But now what happens if we choose nickels? Well, it doesn't know we want it to say nickels because we just hard-coded the pennies. So it's going to correctly calculate. Of course, 20 nickels goes into $1, but it's still saying pennies. So how do we fix that? Again, there's lots of ways to fix it, but I very much like my data dictionaries. So I'm going to come back up here, and I'm going to create another one. We can just, for this, copy this breakdown. That way we don't have to retype it all. We'll call this breakdown string to know what we should have it say. And we'll do pennies, nickels. We're basically making it the plural of each of these IDs. For $1 bills, I'm going to make it a little bit different to make it easier to read. We'll do $1 bills. Do that, paste it for each of these, and up that. So if it's not clear what this is doing right now, it should be in a second. Let's take this pennies out, have that space, and then we're going to go ahead and use that breakdown string and pass the breakdown again into that and see what we should be adding to this. So now, if we go to Edge again and reload, do 1 penny, or $1. In pennies, that's 100 pennies, right? Nickels, 20 nickels, dimes, quarters, etc. And you can see it's calculating properly. One $1 bill. But what happens if we go up to 5? Well, 0 $5 bills, right? But we don't know what to use to break this down. What's the next largest thing? It's $1, right? So how do we move down? How do we get it so it says we have 0 $5 bills, but you can pay it with one $1 bill? Similar to if we go back here to show it as an example on here, if I put in $1 and choose $5 bills and calculate, you'll see it says the 0 to the $5 bills, and it also says $1 because that's the next breakdown. So how do we get it to do that? Well, we could create calculated functions for each of our elements. the penny, nickel, dime, quarter, etc. We could create multiple pieces in this function, but all that's pretty wordy, and we know that we're going to have a very small, limited number of breakdowns available. And because of that, we can just call this function again. And that's why I was talking about recursion before. A very light explanation for those of you that don't know what recursion is. Recursion basically just means the function is going to be calling itself. I won't go too into detail with that. I'll provide some resources in the description so that you guys understand what that means if you are interested in it. But we'll just go ahead and start with it here. We have the result here, and we have the breakdown and payment. First, what we're going to want to do is we're only going to want to print stuff to the result. There are values in it, right? If, as an example, we go back here and we do $1 and say 1 cent with $5 bills, you can see it does the $5 bills, the $1, and the 1 penny, but it's not showing any nickels, dimes, quarters, etc. If we have the result just adding the breakdown count and string every time, it's going to be showing 0 and whatever that is for the ones that weren't able to break it down at all. So let's start by having an if statement. We'll use the breakdown count. We're going to want it to be bigger than 0. And this is where that top feature also comes in. If we have the $5 bill, we want to see that we can't break it down by the $5 bill, right? Or the $10 bill, etc. We want the user to see why we're not showing any of those and we're showing other things instead. So that's where we're going to have or top, which just means or top equals true. It's the first piece of the breakdown. In this if statement, we'll go ahead and do that result plus equals. I'm actually just going to copy this to save time, and we can dig that out. And so that we have a different line for each one of these breakdowns, we're also going to add into the result a break, or there we go, a break tag. And this is just so if we go over here, we can see each of these is on a new line. Finally, we'll want this to stop somewhere. We're going to be calling this function over and over, and the very most important part of the recursion is we're going to want an exit statement. So before we call the recursive statement, we'll want to have a way that it can break this chain. So we do so if the breakdown that's passed in is equal to penny, the smallest breakdown we have available, we're just going to go ahead and return result. Otherwise, result is going to be equal to plus equal this calculate breakdown, this function we're in. We're going to pass payment, which is the updated value that's left over, false, because this is no longer going to be the first call of this function. And we're going to pass in the next piece of the breakdown, which we can get from this breakdown relationship up here. So breakdown relationship. Once we go through this function over and over, let's say we start with dimes, for example. We first passed in a dime. It goes through this, sees how many dimes goes into the value, see how much is left over, that stuff. Then it will call itself again because it's not equal to dimes. And it will go to nickels, and it'll run all this for nickels. Checks if you're using pennies. You're not, so it'll call itself again. Go to pennies, do everything, and then it'll see that you're breaking down on pennies, and it'll return. And then that return will go back to this function here, that where it was called, and go to the next line, which will be return results. Therefore, finishing up this function and passing it out to this result inner HTML where it was originally called. So let's see if this worked. Let's go to Edge, reload, and let's do $1 and 1 cent again. As pennies, it should be 101, which it is. As nickels, it should be 20 nickels and 1 penny. And we can see here it is doing that. Dimes, 10 dimes, 1 penny, quarters, etc. And if we go all the way up to 20, we can see it's 0 $20 bills, but it is a $1 bill and 1 penny. And just like on the other one that we showed, you can have any value you want in here, 361 and I don't know, 48 cents. Calculate, and you can see what this breaks down to at any of these levels. So now we have all the main pieces of this done. So you can see here a lot of pennies. But how do we make it look like this? So let's get started with that. So we're actually going to be creating another link here so our style.css can be read. It's going to be a link. It's going to be a style sheet. We'll pass style CSS into it. This is just saying grab the styling from the style.css sheet, but we have nothing in there currently. It'll be pretty easy what we're doing. I already have all my CSS up on the sides so that we don't have to, waste time Googling or anything. We're going to make the background color equal to we'll have the font family for right now just be sans serif. And we're going to make the font size 21 pixels. We go and reload the page. You can see how that updated. So let's go ahead and do the rest. All right, now that that is done, you can go ahead and copy this into your own or style it however you want, which is why I'm not spending too much time on this piece. And also, for example, if you're unsure what margin auto means, you could go ahead and Google that. All these are very easily accessible. So I don't want to spend too much time on it to keep this video linked down. But if we were to reload, we can see now that it is center screened. We have the background color with the white, the dark blue words, and the ability to still calculate whatever we wanted. There's one last piece of this though. If we open DevTools and we change this to a smaller design, let's say iPhone 12, we can see that this is not very usable on a small screen, right? And we're creating a web app here. We want it to be as accessible as possible. Now in this exercise, I'm not going to be showing how to do it with every screen size, but I will show how to do it on more of an iPhone screen size or any kind of phone you're using there. And to do that, we're going to actually be using, if I go back to index.html, we're going to be using a meta tag. We're going to want to get the size of the screen. So we'll do meta name. This is called a viewport for those of you who have not used it before. And then the content, we can specify what information we'll want and any rules we have for scaling. So we want to get the width, and that will be equal to the device width. The initial scale, which I just always set to 1, but I'm sure there's use cases when it is beneficial not to. 1 point. The maximum scale, which will also be 1. User scalable equals no, which basically means the user can't change the sizes. I don't want my users zooming in or anything on this. We're just going to make it right the first time for phones. So with this new information, we can head back to the styling and we can use a media CSS tag, which basically says, take a look at, any of the media information you have. In this case, we have the width. So if our width is smaller than, let's say, 830 pixels, which I found is a good one to work with in this instance, what do we want to do? Well, we'll want to update some of the stuff so that it doesn't look so weird on the phone, right? We don't need the main container to only be 50% of the width on a small phone. We want it to be the full width, right? So let me go ahead and start with that. Again, I'm just going to speed up and you guys can copy what I have or work on your own. But we're going to use the same container names of what we had above. And again, this will only be used for screens that have a width smaller than 830 scaled pixels. All right, I believe I got everything in here that I want to do for styling. So now, if we come back over here, I'm going to actually open this on another page as well. You can still see at a normal size, this looks fine. Or my zoom didn't, but still. But if we come back on the phone and reload, we can see now that this takes up the full width. And we also have this payment amount of 0, etc. So on a phone, we'd be able to put in $2 or whatever we want. Choose something like $5, and we can see we can't scroll around here. It'll just go back to where it is and calculate, and you can see it's the breakdown. Much easier to use than what was there before. One important note to my styling, however, and I recommend that you guys keep watch of this. On smaller media, specifically on iPhones and probably Android, I don't have an Android, but I do have an iPhone. If your inputs, selects, anything like that on a form, if they're smaller than a font size of 16 pixels, when you click on them, it'll zoom in the screen. I'm sure you've all used websites like that before. It's annoying because you click on something to type in like this. You can type in $2. When you press done and it enters, you have to zoom yourself back out, right? Very annoying. That's because the websites don't have a font size of at least 16 pixels for those inputs. So make sure you have that. Anyway, that is all of what I wanted to show with how to do this web app. There's, of course, lots of things that you can improve with it, and I highly recommend you do for further exercises. For one, having an option to choose different kinds of currencies would be a very beneficial thing with this. You should play around also with styling. Maybe for the breakdown, you can add 50-cent pieces, $100 bills, etc. You can always add some nice animations or things with CSS or the JavaScript. Also, you can add more media sizes, which I think is a great idea of what to do. An example is if we come back here to the phone version and we take a look at, say, an iPad mini, this could definitely look a lot nicer, right? So that would be another great exercise. If anyone creates this and wants to show it off or show any of the additions or changes or anything that they make for this, I highly encourage that you link it into the description so other people can see. I think that would be a great thing to do. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and check the description below for any of those resources that I mentioned throughout this video.